So we're in United States History book. We're in chapter 28, section 1, American Society during the Cold War. So now we're going to talk about what the people were doing during this time. How was life? How is life different then and from now? And so you can see here during the Cold War period, we're talking about that period of time from the end of World War II, to the end of probably around Jimmy Carter, when Reagan became president, actually ended the Cold War. So we have a large period of time between when Eisenhower was president all the way through Eisenhower in the 1940s to clear to the early 1970s with Jimmy Carter. So here we have some of the things. So we can look at life during the Cold War. So here we have, look at the hairstyles here. Here's some of the video games that were played, the Atari game there, bicycles, some of the comics, onto the cars that were driven during that time, some of the hippie movement, the teenage movement. They were fad was to get how many people into one car. Here we're watching television. Television actually became famous during this time. And of course, here is a picture of a soldier coming back from war. So let's begin and let's find out more about American society during the Cold War period. The American Dream. The American dream is that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for every man, with opportunity for each according to his ability or achievement. James Truslow Adams. Basically, we're talking about what is the American dream. A lot of people have different ideas about that. In foreign countries, I remember some Australian friends asked me, what do you think the American dream is? And what do you think the American dream is? So here we have, it's that dream that basically every person has the opportunity here to live to his ability or achievement of his dream. So we have talking about economic prosperity following World War II that allowed Americans to spend more time relaxing and enjoying their new technologies that were actually coming to be, things like cell phones, things like video games, the beginning, and things like television, all these things now they had more time for. So, but not everything was peaceful during the Cold War. There were violent protests, and the threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union caused Americans to try to seek relief, as being under that stress. And many Americans wanted to fill the void of despair by liberation through all different avenues. So we'll find that, and we're going to get into some of those things. So here we have the pictures. You can say, Save the American Dream, little girl with a flag, and you have the American Dream family. I like what Ronald Reagan said, and he's not really during this period of time, but he actually was during the time of the end of the Cold War. And he says, the American dream is not that every man must be level with every other man. The American dream is that every man must be free to become whatever God intends he should be. Don't you love that? The American dream is to be whatever God intends you to be, to live for the Lord. I love that about Ronald Reagan. Here's some pictures here of a family here, and down here, this is what President Gerald Ford said. He said, the American dream does not come to those who fall asleep. So he's saying, you can't fall asleep. You must do the next thing, right? You must keep busy, not say, oh, okay, I'm just going to sit here and let the American dream come. No, you do the next thing that God has for you to do. Technological advances, and we're going to talk about health, space exploration, communications and electronics, and transportation. So there's going to be some big advances during this period of time here, things that would change our lives totally. In health, we know, of course, there was polio during that time, was actually causing many children to become crippled, and to find a cure for that. It's amazing. And of course, space exploration. Do we ever think we would go to the moon? Or how about our communications and electronics with cell phones? And transportation now. Well, now we would have automobiles to go where we wanted to go. So as you see in the picture here, and of course, here's DNA. They would discover DNA. Here's a little girl with one of the first televisions there. And here's one of the first computers. Here is basically this vaccine for polio onto the different kinds of cars and to the planes. This is the first, actually one of the first radio type cell phones. And here's one of the Apple computers. Can you imagine if you had to work on this Apple computer? So let's talk about health first. So what was happening during this time in the health industry? Well, during World War II, there were few medical advancements occurred during the war. Everyone was focused on the war, of course. But after the war, money was available for research, so America led the way in the medical field for advancements never dreamed of before. So some of these advancements, as you can see here. So of course here we have, in healthcare here, we have the study. Here's the study of DNA here, onto the study of MRI machine to take, basically to be able to detect cancer with magnetic imaging. Of course, we have polio vaccine. Of course, we have now our research knowing that smoking cigarettes, tobacco causes cancer. Here we have penicillin being used. And of course, we're going to have surgeries never dreamed of. In fact, transplants and such. And so here, a lot of advancements in the health field during this time. Vaccines. In 1952, a record number of 57,879 polio cases were reported. That's a lot. And most of them were children. And polio, of course, causes major problems, even to the point of being on a respirator, not be able to walk. And we know, especially FDR, he was hit with polio and had to be in a wheelchair. So all these things, polio was very drastic. So in 1955, Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine. And in 1962, Albert Bruce Sabin perfected another type, an oral type, to be administered orally. So, and this led to virtually the eradication of polio in the United States. You rarely hear now of polio any place, let alone in the United States. So that was pretty much of a miracle. Maurice Ralph Hillman, he also developed 40 different ones and vaccine, and including measles, mumps, meningitis, and pneumonia for pneumonia. So during this time. On to cancer research. The National Cancer Act was made at this time. So in 1949 was the first chemotherapy drug to combat cancer. In 1950, research linked smoking to cancer. And then the anti-smoking campaigns began fighting the smoking in the societal norms. So basically starting to say, no, it's not cool anymore to smoke. And today we know smoking causes cancer, not only cancer, but other health problems too, including heart disease. In 1971, the National Cancer Act became a law allowing millions of dollars to be spent for cancer research. So during Nixon's administration, he signed the Cancer Research National Cancer Act. DNA research, Human Genome Project. So basically DNA deoxyribonucleic acid was discovered in the 1860s, and little was known about this substance that was at the nucleus of the cell. So they discovered it, they didn't know exactly what that meant. Not until the 1940s was DNA used to determine to determine that to contain the human genes, heredity. So basically, they found out that's what DNA is about. That it's in the nucleus, and it will basically tell us what our heredity would be. So determine that. So in 1953, James Watson, he lived 1928, and he's still alive, I guess, and Francis Crick, 1916 to 2004, accurately determined that DNA was a double helix structure. What it looked like. Here they are hanging out here, these guys, Crick and Watson. See here they actually see how they made a model of the DNA. Both of them are smiling. I would be smiling too. So in 1990, researchers launched the Human Genome Project, a massive effort to identify all of the 24,000 genes in human DNA. So now the Human Genome Project now is that research project to determine all of what's in DNA and all of these genes. The identification of genes associated with certain cancers and genetic conditions were important to find, right? So in the DNA testing and identification of crime suspects and victims, so more accurate matching for organ donors, improved diagnosis and treatment of diseases. These were all determined in the genes. So now we can use DNA testing to identify if someone committed a crime if they left DNA behind. Or if you had to have a kidney transplant, you could find an organ donor by matching your DNA with another. Or just the improved diagnosis and see how certain diseases are transmitted through heredity, So to know some of these things would be very important in the health field, don't you think? Other medical advances. In 1954, we had the first kidney transplant that was conducted by a doctor in Massachusetts. Then in 1968 was our first successful adult heart transplant. In 1970 was magnetic resonance imagery. So it was invented by Paul Laterber. He was American, and Peter Mansfield. So MRI is what we call them, right? So in 1980, Raymond Damadia recognized that MRI could detect cancer. So in 1980, American Psychiatric Association identified post-traumatic stress disorder as a major concern for the mental health of returning veterans of war. So these are other advances. We have, here's a picture of the first kidney transplant. These guys, I think, were twins, and one of the guys was giving his kidney to the other guy, so his brother. And here we have the gift of a human heart and heart transplant. Here's another picture of heart transplant, I think. Here's the MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging that I talked about before, the MRI. And so here we have PTSD. And PTSD is concerned a post-traumatic stress disorder, was in the mental health area. So space exploration now. Okay, the space race. On October 1957, Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, alarming America. Then think, what are they doing? They launched a satellite in space. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. Then Sputnik 2 followed in the next month with an altitude in excess of 1,000 miles. Congress responded by appropriating $40 billion for defense, reorganizing the Defense Department. And Congress created NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, for space research and development. And then on January 31st, 1958, the United States launched Explorer 1 into orbit. So the space race, as you can see, occurred very quickly. So here we have Sputnik 1 here. Here's a picture. And basically it was pretty small, a satellite. But of course we would think, oh, if they're launching a satellite in space, what are they doing that for? Probably to spy on us. That's the first thing we would think, right? And the second one was Sputnik. Guess what? In Sputnik 2, they had a dog. They launched a dog. The Russians launched a dog in space. Here's Sputnik 2. But they put a dog and he came back. So, and then on to NASA being formed then. And our first satellite, Explorer 1, right here into orbit. Here's the NASA team. The Russian-American space race. So Russia continued with Sputnik and Luna series of artificial satellites. So they kept on putting up more satellites. And then the United States launched several satellites, including the Explorers, the Vanguards, and the Discoverers of satellites. In 1950, the Soviet Union seemed far in the lead in the space research and development. So, in fact, they had launched the first astronaut into space. And actually, they launched the first woman astronaut into space. So you can see, here's one of the cosmonauts here. And of course, they call them cosmonauts. And then America called her space men astronauts. So here we have pictures here of, this is our satellite here. We're going to talk about these things here, but this is a picture of a space race here between the Russian, when I say Russian, the Soviet Union, and America, United States. Pioneer astronauts and satellites. During the Kennedy administration, it became very important as President Kennedy was very, very interested in getting ahead in space exploration, ahead of the Russians. So Project Mercury was a single-manned space flight. They were all singles, one man would be launched in space. On May 1961, Commander Alan B. Shepard Jr., he lived 1923 to 1998, became the first American in space. Here's a picture of Alan Shepard here. So, and that was with the Mercury project. On to February 1962, so we're talking about, just in the next year, Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn, who lived 1921 to 2016, became the first American to orbit the Earth. Here's a picture of John Glenn here, orbiting the Earth. In 1962, also Telstar was launched for television, and Relay was launched for radio, television, and telephone. So two of our communication satellites were launched during this time. And then on December 1962, Mariner 2, was an interplanetary research satellite, passed near Venus. Here we have a picture of it passing near Venus here. On February 1962, NASA announced data from Mariner 2 indicated that there was no life on Venus. It was far too hot. So we have a satellite here going to Venus. We have our satellites for telecommunication. And of course, now we have launched men, one orbiting the Earth, John Glenn, and we have Alan Shepard being that first American in space. Now, little to know that Russians were ahead of us on this. But we had the first man on the moon. So in the 1960s, American space programs with Gemini, which means two men. So when you say Gemini, it means two. So two men would be going up in space. And Apollo would take three men into space. So one was a two-man project and the other was a three-man project with the Apollos. Well, on Christmas Eve, 1968, millions of people of the world heard the Apollo 8 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, and they read from the Genesis account of creation as they orbited 7 miles above the moon. Isn't that amazing? So here they were looking back at Earth as they orbited the moon, and they were quoting the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. They were like evangelists out there in space. So, and that was the Apollo 8. Here's a picture of the Apollo 8 team right here with Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders in this picture here. In 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong lived 1930 to 2012. Buzz Aldrin, who was born 1930 and he's still alive, and Michael Collins, who also, they were all born the same year, these astronauts. Here's a picture of them down here. And Buzz Aldrin actually lives in Auburn, California, I think, so close to where we lived. So here they are, a picture of, here's Neil Armstrong. He'd be credited as the first man to walk on the moon. Millions of television viewers watched as Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." For 22 hours, they collected moon samples, moon rocks or lunar soil samples, and did some experiments and took photographs on the moon. They erected the American flag and unveiled a plaque. And this plaque would say, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." So they set that up on the moon. Although there was no life on the moon, but they set it on the moon. We know that other nations later on would go to the moon. So America was now in the lead of the space race. First man on the moon. So continuing this space exploration. So in 1975, Apollo-Soyuz test project, that's what they called it, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And this included both the United States and the Soviet Union, and they participated together, jointly. So this kind of brought peace in the midst that here's actually the American team and here's the Soviet team. So, and this is 1975, so it's down the road a little bit. An Apollo spacecraft docked with the Soyuz spacecraft. United States astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts exchanged goodwill messages and experiments. So here are the two space stations docking together. In 1981, NASA launched the first space shuttle, the Columbia. It was a reusable space plane that could carry satellites, telescopes, and cargo into space and then return to Earth. So this was the Columbia. The space travel thrived until 1986. Well, what happened in 1986? The Challenger exploded. The space Challenger exploded at Cape Canaveral, and all 7 of its crew were killed. So the space station exploded, and this slowed down from that point of sending Americans into space. One of them was a school teacher that was on the Challenger. So the Challenger was a horrific accident. So this explosion slowed down the space program. In 1990, though, we sent up the Hubble Space Telescope. And this was launched, and this revolutionized astronomy because it was and taking these clear pictures and images wherever it went, and being able to send them back to Earth was just amazing. So, and here's some pictures. Here's a picture right here of the Hubble spacecraft took this in of the galaxies in space, and onto the Milky Way. And here's a picture of the Hubble here actually taking pictures of the Earth. So Hubble is one of the greatest developments in astronomy ever. So space. On to communication and electronics. So we're going to talk about telecommunication. In 1951, the transcontinental telephone dialing services were first begun. So you can see here, putting up these telephone poles and these cables, some of the cables going underground. Undersea telephone cables were laid in 1956. European and Americans now could speak to each other as they laid the cables underneath the ocean floor, or down to, to the ocean floor. So in 1957, Hawaii was then connected to the United States mainland by undersea telephone cable. This actually is a picture of that. The cellular phones, though, were wireless phones, and that technology used radio signals to transmit messages, so it did not need the cable. At the beginning, though, the cell phones were very primitive. Here's a picture of a cell phone, very primitive, and it was basically using radio waves. But until fiber optics came into being, and that made it easier for the wireless cell phones with fiber optics. Here's a picture of fiber optics. Fiber optics have to do with lasers. Here's a guy talking on one of the first cell phones, wireless cell phones here, and they're using the telephone booth. Television. Okay, how could we live without television? But they did. So not until this time in the 1960s was television perfected. So rapid improvements in television technology enabled 90% of Americans to own one by 1960. 90%, that's a lot. 3 broadcasting networks were available, only 3 channels really. We had CBS, ABC, and NBC. So these channels, these broadcasting networks are still with us. They were all in operation at this time. The greatest technological marvel was color television. So here's a picture of color television. I remember getting we had black and white television when I was young. And it was not until later on that we finally got colored TV, and it did look like this, similar to that. Here's another color TV, but ours looked kind of like that. So CBS led the way with the first commercial color broadcast, and soon others followed, improving color and clarity. Most Americans had color televisions by the end of the Cold War. So I remember everyone's like, we have to get a color TV. We have to get everybody said we need one right away. So everybody ran to get a color TV and change their old black and white TVs, get rid of their black and white TVs. So here's a picture of the first TV, how everyone sat around and watched the few stations that became. Look at this. This is one of the very first TV. Look how primitive that TV is. Just think if you had that now. Computers. Microchips are these tiny electronic components, and they greatly excelled the computer industry. Smaller computers could be built, which became less expensive. The earliest computers filled entire rooms with miles of wiring and tubes. The IBM, International Business Machines, they called them, were the first company to dominate the computer industry, IBM. In 1980, IBM chose Microsoft Corporation to take over the needed operating systems for PCs. What are PCs? PCs are personal computers. Microsoft was developed by Bill Gates. He's still alive, in 1955. Everyone knows about him, right? And Paul Allen, 1953 to 2008. Here's a picture of them when they were young, developing the computer of Microsoft. And so here you have computer chip, how tiny, and how the computer chip is complete. Looks like a complete miracle to get all that information on that little chip. And so here we have some of the first computers. Look at here. Here's the whole room. I remember when I worked at the blood service in Sioux City, at the American Association of Blood Services, and we had a computer, and we had to make sure that computer was working all the time, and it took up a whole room. And in that whole room, we had to keep it air conditioned cold. If it got too hot, it would break down. So it was crazy back then. So that was not too long ago in my lifetime, that's for sure. Here we have another picture of a first computer with a television on it. And here we have, of course, the application system of the computer, and onto some of the first computers, those pictures. Apple computer. So in 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded their computer company, Apple Computers. Steve Jobs lived in 1955 to 2001, and Steve Wozniak still alive from 1950. So Apple I and Apple II computers allowed even more people to own their own personal computers. They even went to the school systems and some of the school systems and bought all these little Apple computers for the schools back then. By the end of the Cold War, computers played a key role in factories, businesses, and households of millions of Americans. So here we have these guys, Steve Jobs, and right here, and Steve Wozniak with Apple computers. You know, here's one of the first Apple computers. Here's their logo, of course. Communication satellites. Satellites in space gave access to live television broadcast through satellite dishes. Fiber optics are like these laser beams that travel through thin glass. These glass threads are fibers, and they carry thousands of telephone signals, and the television broadcasts or computer information on these fiber optics, they call them. You know, so a GPS, Global Positioning System, aided telecommunications too. Of course, you know about GPS. You probably have that in your phone to find out where to go now. Now we couldn't live without it. Back then we didn't have global positioning system in our phones. And it was controlled by satellites capable of pinpointing a position on Earth. So it's all about these satellites in space. GPS was then integrated into automobiles, law enforcement tools, and to cell phones. GPS, communication satellites here. And so here we have some pictures of communication satellite. Here's another one. This, of course, is the fiber optics, you know, these were the satellite dishes. We used to have satellite dishes so we get different television channels from the satellite systems going on. And here, of course, is a primitive GPS system before they got to the point where we could put them into our phones. Internet. So I'm going to stop here because we still have to go in a few other things. So I'm going to stop here and take a break, and then we're going to get into the internet.